gasoline soaked into the expensive oak floors of Moretti's, pooling around the Italian leather boots of New York's most feared bratva boss. Nikolai Rostov raised his gold-plated Zippo, his cold blue eyes devoid of mercy, ready to burn the restaurant and everyone inside to ash. Roberto wept. The armed men waited. Then from the trembling lips of a terrified waitress, hiding beneath a shattered table, came a fragile melody. A Russian lullaby. The exact song his murdered mother used to sing. Rain battered the glass facade of Moretti's fine dining, distorting the neon lights of the Manhattan streets into violent streaks across the wet pavement. Inside, the evening's final patrons had long departed, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence. The air, usually thick with the rich scents of garlic, black truffle, and simmering marinara, now tasted metallic and stale. It tasted like fear. Lily Hayes wiped down the polished mahogany bar for the fourth time, her hands raw from bleach and hot water. She was 22, a quiet, fiercely hard-working girl, trapped in a relentless cycle of minimum-wage shifts and overdue rent. To the wealthy elite who dined at Moretti's, she was merely a uniform, a ghost who refilled their crystal water glasses. To the owner Roberto, she was a dependable kid who closed up shop and never asked questions. But tonight, ignoring the palpable dread radiating from Roberto's office was impossible. For 3 weeks, a dark cloud had hung over the establishment. Roberto had been pacing his office, sweating through his expensive tailored suits, making frantic phone calls that always ended in him slamming the receiver down in despair. Lily had overheard enough fragments to piece together the nightmare. The restaurant had been failing. Desperate to keep his family's legacy alive and secure, a Michelin star, Roberto had sought capital outside the traditional banking system. He had taken a massive loan from an entity operating behind a legitimate-sounding Front Kozlov Harbor Logistics. Everyone in the underground knew Kozlov Harbor was merely a shell company for the Rostov syndicate. At the head of this syndicate sat Nikolai Rostov. He was a phantom to the authorities, but a terrifying reality to anyone who owed him money. Rumors painted him not just as a mobster, but as a ruthless architect of pain who had seized control of the Russian underworld in New York after a bloody, systematic purge of his rivals. He was a man who didn't negotiate. He collected. And if you couldn't pay with money, you paid with flesh, blood, or ashes. The antique grandfather clock in the corner of the dining room struck midnight. The heavy chime echoed like a funeral bell. Lily. Roberto's voice trembled as he stepped out of his office. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning. His usually slicked-back hair was disheveled, his eyes bloodshot. "You need to go home. Now. Leave the rest of the cleaning." Lily paused, the damp rag hovering over the wood. "Mr. Roberto, I haven't finished the floor in the back and the register." "Leave it!" He snapped, his voice cracking with a desperate edge. Then, softening, he took a step forward, his hands shaking. "Please, Lily. Take the back alley. Go straight to the subway. Do not look back." Before she could unfasten her apron, a low, rhythmic rumble vibrated through the floorboards. The sound of 3 heavy-duty SUVs pulling up onto the curb right outside the front doors. Headlights cut through the heavy rain, flooding the dimly lit dining room in a blinding, aggressive white glare. Roberto let out a strangled sob, backing away from the glass doors. "God have mercy," he whispered, crossing himself. "They are early." Lily's heart hammered against her ribs. She dropped the rag, her instincts screaming at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. She backed into the shadows near the service station, slipping behind the heavy velvet curtains that separated the main dining area from the private booths. She held her breath, peering through a small gap in the fabric. The front doors didn't just open. They were violently kicked inward. The lock shattered the brass handle, flying across the room, and skidding across the expensive tiles. 5 men stepped inside. They were massive, dressed in dark trench coats, radiating an aura of casual brutality. But it was the man who walked in last that made the oxygen flee the room. Nikolai Rostov was devastatingly imposing. He didn't carry the bulky, unrefined muscle of his enforcers. Instead, he moved with the predatory grace of a starving wolf. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that clung perfectly to his broad shoulders. His face was all sharp angles and cold stone framed by dark hair, but it was his eyes that paralyzed. They were a pale, piercing blue, like glacial ice, completely devoid of warmth or human empathy. A faint, jagged scar ran from his jawline down beneath his collar, a brutal souvenir from his violent ascent to power. "Roberto," Nikolai spoke. His voice was a low, resonant baritone with a thick, undeniable Russian edge. It wasn't a shout. It was a terrifyingly calm statement of fact. "You missed our deadline." "Mr. Rostov," Roberto stammered, dropping to his knees, so fast his kneecaps hit the floorboards with a sickening thud. "Please. The banks, they froze my accounts. I just need 1 more week. I have the money, I swear to you. I just need the wire transfer to clear." Nikolai didn't blink. He slowly reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, pulling out a pair of black leather gloves. He slid them on with agonizing deliberation, finger by finger. "Dmitri," Nikolai murmured without looking away from the weeping restaurant owner. His right-hand man, a giant with a shaved head and a neck covered in Cyrillic tattoos, stepped forward. Dmitri didn't say a word. He simply walked over to the custom-built floor-to-ceiling wine cellar that housed Roberto's most prized vintage collections. With a casual swing of a heavy steel crowbar, Dmitri smashed the glass. The sound was deafening. Hundreds of bottles of Chateau Margaux and Louis XIII cognac cascaded to the floor, exploding into a sea of red and amber. The pungent aroma of fermented grapes and aged alcohol flooded the room, looking horrifyingly like blood pooling across the floorboards. Roberto screamed a sound of pure agony. "No, please, that's my life. That's my grandfather's collection." "Your life," Nikolai said, stepping carefully around the spreading puddle of wine, "was mortgaged to me 3 months ago. Your grandfather's collection is simply the interest." Lily clapped both hands over her mouth to muffle her own terrified whimpers. She was huddled tightly behind the velvet curtain, her back pressed against the cold plaster wall. She had read about men like this in cheap thrillers, but seeing the casual clinical destruction in real life was paralyzing. Another enforcer began flipping the heavy oak tables, shattering crystal centerpieces, and tearing the imported Italian chandeliers from the ceiling. The beautiful romantic atmosphere of Moretti's was being dismantled, piece by piece, in a symphony of violence. "I beg you." Roberto crawled forward, grasping at the hem of Nikolai's trousers. "Take the deed. Take the building. Just let me live." Nikolai looked down at the man with utter disgust. He kicked Roberto away, sending the older man sprawling into the shards of broken glass. "The building is already mine, Roberto. I took the deed yesterday when your payment bounced. Now I am just clearing out the trash." Nikolai gestured to Dmitri. "Burn it." Dmitri nodded. He walked to the bar and hoisted a massive metal canister he had brought in from the SUV. He unscrewed the cap and began sloshing raw gasoline over the velvet booths, the shattered tables, and the expensive rugs. The sharp, toxic fumes immediately overpowered the smell of the spilled wine. Lily's eyes widened in sheer horror. She was trapped. If she ran out now, they would shoot her. If she stayed, she would burn alive in the back corridor. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her chest. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. A severe anxiety attack, a demon she had battled since her childhood in the state foster system, was taking hold. As Dmitri splashed gasoline near the service station, A heavy splash of the fuel hit the velvet curtain, hiding Lily. The chemical stench burned her nostrils. In a blind panic, trying to scramble further back into the alcove, her elbow clipped a stack of ceramic serving trays left on a side table. Crash! The sound cut through the room, freezing the men in their tracks. Nikolai's head snapped toward the velvet curtain. The glacial blue of his eyes narrowed. He drew a suppressed Sig Sauer P226 from his holster in a single fluid motion. "Bring whoever that is to me," Nikolai commanded, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. Dmitri lunged forward, ripping the velvet curtain down from its brass rings. The heavy fabric collapsed, revealing Lily. She was curled into a ball, trembling violently, her eyes wide, with unadulterated terror. Dmitri grabbed her by the collar of her uniform, lifting her effortlessly off her feet. Lily kicked and thrashed, but he dragged her out into the main dining room, throwing her roughly onto the floor at Nikolai's feet. She landed hard on the hardwood, right next to the weeping Roberto. "A rat in the walls," Dmitri sneered, raising his boot. "Wait." Nikolai raised a single gloved hand. He stepped closer, towering over Lily. He pointed the barrel of the suppressed pistol directly at her forehead. "Who are you, and what have you heard?" Lily couldn't speak. Her vocal cords were paralyzed by fear. She stared down the dark barrel of the gun, her mind fragmenting under the immense weight of her impending death. Her heart beat so fast, it felt like a hummingbird trapped behind her ribs. "I asked you a question, little girl," Nikolai said, his thumb resting on the hammer of the gun. The metallic click of the hammer pulling back echoed loudly in the silent gasoline-soaked room. Her vision blurred. The hyperventilation was peaking, her brain desperate for any anchor, any shred of comfort in what she believed were her final seconds, retreated to the deepest, safest corner of her memory. She remembered her time in the cold, unfeeling foster home in Queens. She remembered the old, stooped Russian woman next door, Mrs. Volkov. When little Lily would have these paralyzing night terrors, Mrs. Volkov would hold her, stroke her hair, and sing an obscure, mournful song from the old country to bring her heart rate down. Lily didn't realize she was doing it until the sound vibrated in her own chest. Her eyes rolled up, staring blindly at the ceiling, and she began to hum. It started as a fragile, broken vibration. Then, as she tried to force air into her lungs, the humming turned into a soft, trembling whisper. She didn't know the language, but she knew the phonetic sounds perfectly. "Spi moja radost usni." Sleep, my joy, fall asleep. "Vi doma pogasli ogni." The lights in the house have gone out, Dmitri scoffed, raising his weapon. "She's lost her mind. Let me put her down, boss." But Nikolai didn't move. The moment the first syllable left Lily's lips, the air around the Mafia boss seemed to freeze. The gun in his hand, steady as a steel girder just a second ago, wavered. His breath hitched in his throat. Lily closed her eyes, rocking slightly back and forth, entirely consumed by the coping mechanism, letting the melody grow just a fraction louder. "Ptishki usnuli v sadu." The birds have fallen asleep in the garden. "Rybki usnuli v prudu." The fishes have fallen asleep in the pond. It wasn't just a standard lullaby. It was a specific regional variation from a small, forgotten village in the Ural Mountains. It had a unique, melancholic bridge that no one outside of that specific province knew. Nikolai's mind was violently ripped backward through time. He was no longer standing in a gasoline-soaked restaurant in New York. He was 7 years old, huddled in a freezing, crumbling apartment in Yekaterinburg. The sounds of his drunken father breaking furniture echoed from the kitchen. But in his bedroom, his mother Oksana was holding him tight, pressing his face to her chest. She was bleeding, but she smiled through her tears, stroking his dark hair and singing that exact melody, with that exact, peculiar rhythm to drown out the violence. It was the very last song Oksana ever sang before his father killed her. "Boss?" Dmitri asked, noticing the sudden shocking pallor on Nikolai's usually stoic face. Nikolai slowly lowered the gun. His eyes, previously dead and cold, were now wide, filled with a chaotic storm of shock, grief, and disbelief. He stared at the trembling girl on the floor, as if she were a ghost, conjured from the depths of his own traumatized soul. "Stop," Nikolai whispered. The word barely made it past his lips. Dmitri frowned, confused. "Boss, the fuel is prepped. We need to light it and go." "I said stop," Nikolai roared, the sudden explosion of volume, making every man in the room flinch. He holstered his weapon and took a step toward Lily. He dropped to one knee, ignoring the puddles of ruined wine and gasoline soaking into his expensive trousers. He reached out his gloved hand, hovering inches from Lily's face. She flinched violently, expecting a strike, and the song died on her lips, replaced by a terrified sob. "Where?" Nikolai's voice shook an emotion, breaking through his iron facade that his men had never ever witnessed. "Where did you learn that song?" Lily opened her eyes, tears spilling over her cheeks. She looked at the terrifying mobster, confused by the sudden vulnerability in his expression. I... Tell me," he demanded, his voice thick with an emotion that bordered on desperation. "That melody, the bridge. My mother. Only my mother sang it that way." "Who are you?" Lily swallowed hard, her throat raw. "A woman. Mrs. Volkov. In Queens. I was a foster kid. She used to sing it to me when I had panic attacks. I don't even know what the words mean. Please don't kill me." Nikolai stared at her, the silence stretching out for an agonizing eternity. The brutal kingpin of the New York Bratva was completely disarmed by a terrified waitress with a borrowed memory. He looked around the ruined restaurant, the lighter still gripped tightly in his left hand. He looked at Roberto, who was still cowering on the floor, and then back down to Lily, whose innocent, tear-streaked face mirrored the helpless vulnerability he had felt as a little boy. Slowly, deliberately, Nikolai snapped the gold-plated Zippo shut. "Dmitri," Nikolai said, his voice returning to a low, authoritative calm, though his eyes never left Lily's. "Yes, boss." "Clean this up." "We are leaving." Dmitri blinked, completely stunned. "But the debt, the message." "The debt is forgiven," Nikolai stated, standing up and towering over the room once more. He looked down at Lily, a profound, almost protective shadow crossing his features. "And the restaurant stays untouched. Tell your men to fall back." Silence fell over Moretti's like a heavy, suffocating wool blanket, the moment the tail lights of the black SUVs vanished into the violent Manhattan rain. For a long time, the only sound was the steady drip of rainwater from the shattered front door, and the jagged breathing of Roberto, who was still kneeling in the puddle of destroyed vintage wine. Lily remained frozen against the wall, her knees pulled tight to her chest. She was trembling so violently that her teeth chattered. She had just looked death in the eyes, sung it a song from her childhood, and watched it walk out the front door. Roberto finally moved. He crawled through the broken glass, ignoring the deep cuts opening on his palms, and threw his arms around Lily's legs. He was sobbing, a broken, hysterical sound. "You saved us." He wept into her apron. "You saved my life, Lily. My family. I don't know what you did. I don't know what you said to that monster, but you saved us." Lily couldn't process his gratitude. Her mind was a static blur of pure adrenaline and lingering terror. He just left," she whispered, her voice sounding hollow and detached. "He left." The next 3 days were a surreal fever dream. Roberto closed the restaurant for emergency renovations, paying for a crew to work around the clock, replacing the shattered oak, the ruined velvet, and the broken glass. He insisted on paying Lily her full wages, plus a massive bonus from his remaining personal savings, begging her to stay home and rest. But staying home in her cramped, drafty apartment on 31st Avenue in Astoria was worse. Without the exhaustion of a double shift to distract her, Lily was left alone with her thoughts. Every shadow looked like Dimitri's towering frame. Every car door slamming outside sounded like the crack of a suppressed pistol. She barely slept, keeping a kitchen knife on her bedside table, entirely convinced that Nikolai Rostov's mercy was a temporary glitch and that he would return to finish the job. On a bleak, overcast Thursday afternoon, her worst fear materialized. Lily was returning from the corner bodega, clutching a plastic bag containing nothing but instant coffee and a loaf of bread. As she turned onto her street, her heart plummeted into her stomach. Parked illegally in front of her crumbling brick apartment building was a pristine, jet-black Mercedes Maybach S680. Its tinted windows were impenetrable, and it looked completely alien against the backdrop of overflowing trash cans and peeling paint. Leaning casually against the hood, wearing a tailored navy suit that poorly concealed his massive muscular frame, was Dimitri. Lily stopped dead in her tracks. Her grip on the plastic bag tightened until her knuckles turned white. Flight instinct screamed at her to drop the groceries and sprint toward the subway station. But she knew better. Men like this didn't let you run. Dimitri spotted her. He didn't smile, but his posture shifted slightly. He opened the rear passenger door of the Maybach and gave her a single, silent nod. Swallowing the lump of absolute terror in her throat, Lily forced her legs to move forward. As she approached the vehicle, she peered into the dark interior. Sitting in the plush, cream-colored leather seat was Nikolai Rostov. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at a tablet dressed impeccably in a midnight blue turtleneck and a dark wool coat. "Get in, Miss Hayes." Nikolai's low baritone voice drifted out of the car. It wasn't a request. Lily slid into the vehicle, the scent of expensive leather and a faint trace of sandalwood immediately enveloping her. Dimitri closed the door with a heavy, final thud, plunging them into quiet isolation, perfectly insulated from the chaotic noise of Queens. "Where are you taking me?" Lily asked, her voice shaking despite her desperate attempt to sound brave. "Roberto's debt is cleared. You said so." Nikolai locked his tablet and set it aside. His glacial blue eyes met hers. In the harsh daylight, filtering through the tinted glass, the jagged scar on his neck looked even more pronounced, a violent slash across smooth skin. "Roberto is a cockroach who was spared by a miracle. I do not care about him. I care about you." He reached into the console between them and pressed a button. A privacy partition slid up, separating them from Dimitri, who was now behind the wheel. The car pulled seamlessly into traffic. "I need to know everything about the woman you called Mrs. Volkov." Nikolai commanded, his tone devoid of the homicidal rage from the restaurant, replaced instead by an intense, burning obsession. Every detail. Where she lived, what she looked like, and where she is now. Lily gripped her knees. Why, she was just a sweet old lady. She didn't have anything to do with your world. You do not get to decide what she had to do with my world. Nikolai snapped his voice, dropping an octave, vibrating with sudden menace. But then he closed his eyes, took a slow breath, and forced his posture to relax. It was a terrifying display of a lethal man reigning in a violent temper. "Please, just answer the question." "She lived next door to my foster home on 43rd Street, Lily whispered, intimidated by his overwhelming presence. Her first name was Anya. Anya Volkov. She had a heavy accent. She always smelled like lavender and old paper. She took care of me when the system failed. When I had panic attacks, she would sing. Nikolai's jaw tightened. Anya. He breathed the name as if it were a fragile piece of glass. Anya was my mother's maiden name. Where is she now? Lily hesitated, seeing the raw, unguarded emotion flickering behind the Mafia boss's eyes. Mr. Rostov. She passed away 3 years ago. Congestive heart failure at Elmhurst Hospital. I was holding her hand when she went. The silence in the Maybach became agonizing. Nikolai turned his head, staring out the window at the passing blur of the city. For a moment, Lily thought she saw a single tear trace down the cold, sharp angle of his cheek, but he wiped it away so fast it might have been an illusion. She was my aunt. Nikolai finally spoke, his voice incredibly quiet. My mother's younger sister. When my family was destroyed in Yekaterinburg, she vanished. We thought she was murdered too. I spent 10 years and millions of dollars tearing apart the Russian underworld looking for her. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh, and she was living in Queens, raising a little American girl. The Maybach didn't stop in Queens. It glided over the Queensboro Bridge, cutting through the heart of Manhattan, before turning into the ultra-exclusive underground garage of a high-rise tower in Tribeca. I have to go to work, Lily protested weakly as Dmitri opened her door. You do not work there anymore, Nikolai stated, stepping out of the car. You are coming with me. We have more to discuss. Lily was ushered into a private biometric-locked elevator that shot up to the penthouse. When the doors opened, she stepped into a world of staggering wealth. The apartment was a sprawling minimalist masterpiece of black marble floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic view of the Hudson River and modern art that likely cost more than her entire life's earnings. Sit, Nikolai directed, gesturing to a massive curved velvet sofa. He walked over to a crystal decanter on a floating glass bar and poured himself 3 fingers of amber liquid. He downed it in a single swallow. Lily sat on the edge of the sofa, clutching her cheap plastic grocery bag. She felt entirely out of place, a dirty stray cat dragged into a palace. Anya. Nikolai began pacing in front of the window, the city lights beginning to flicker to life behind him. Did she leave you anything? A box, documents, a key? No. Lily shook her head. She didn't have any money. The state took her apartment. I only kept one thing, a trinket she gave me for my 18th birthday. She told me it was a talisman to keep the monsters away. Nikolai froze. Show it to me. Lily hesitated. She reached a trembling hand behind her neck and unclasped a cheap silver chain. Sliding off the chain was a heavy, ornate silver pendant. It was shaped like a double-headed eagle clutching a sword and a crescent moon encrusted with 3 tiny, deep red rubies. Nikolai dropped his glass. It shattered against the marble floor, but he didn't even look down. He crossed the room in 2 massive strides and dropped to his knees in front of Lily, his eyes locked on the silver object in her palm. The Rostov seal, he whispered, his hands hovering over hers. He didn't touch her, treating her hands like a sacred altar. This is the seal my grandfather wore. It was the key to the family's original Swiss accounts, the accounts my father murdered my mother for trying to find them. He looked up at Lily, his expression a chaotic mix of awe and a terrifying, possessive intensity. She gave this to you. She said it would protect me, Lily repeated, shrinking back slightly. It put a target on your back, Nikolai corrected, his voice hardening. If any of my rivals, if the Volkov Syndicate loyalists knew you possessed this, they would have flayed you alive. You have been walking around New York City wearing a $500 million target on your chest. Lily gasped, dropping the pendant into her lap as if it burned her. I didn't know, take it. Please just take it and let me go back to my life. Your life is over, Nikolai said. It wasn't a threat. It was a dark, inescapable promise. He finally reached out his large, calloused hands, gently wrapping around her small, trembling ones, closing her fingers over the pendant. You kept my aunt's memory alive. You comforted her when she died alone. And you hold the legacy of my bloodline. He stood up, his massive frame casting a long shadow over her. You are no longer a waitress, Miss Hayes. You are under my absolute protection. You will live here. Dmitri will handle your belongings. If you attempt to run, you will likely be killed by my enemies before the sun sets. From this moment on, you belong to the Rostov Syndicate. Before Lily could scream, before she could even process the reality of being dragged into a Mafia war as a human vault, the penthouse security alarm began to shriek, a deafening, piercing wail that shattered the calm of the gilded cage. Dmitri burst into the room from the private elevator foyer, an assault rifle already raised to his shoulder. Boss, perimeter breach. 4 teams coming up the freight elevators. It's Dominic Rossi's men. They tracked the Maybach. They know she's here. Nikolai's eyes went dead, the soft vulnerability he had shown just seconds ago, instantly replaced by the ruthless, cold-blooded killer that ruled New York. He drew his Sig Sauer. Stay behind me, Nikolai ordered Lily, his voice echoing over the sirens. And do not let go of that pendant. Gunfire erupted with the deafening force of a thunderclap, shattering the fragile illusion of safety within the penthouse. The heavy, bullet-resistant glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows spider-webbed under the impact of high-caliber rounds before entirely giving way, raining a glittering, lethal waterfall of shards across the black marble floors. The freezing wind of the Manhattan night immediately howled into the room, carrying with it the acrid metallic stench of gunpowder and the distant, chaotic wail of city sirens. Dominic Rossi was not a man who believed in half measures. As the head of the rival Camorra faction that had been slowly losing territory to Nikolai's brutal expansion, Rossi had spent the last 3 years cornered like a wounded animal. He was a man of modern sensibilities, favoring corporate espionage, political blackmail, and quiet assassinations over the loud, messy street wars of the past. But the discovery that Nikolai Rostov had located the lost heir to the Volkov fortune, and more importantly, the silver pendant that unlocked the legendary offshore accounts, had forced Rossi to abandon his subtle tactics. He needed that key, and he was willing to burn Tribeca to the ground to get it. Nikolai's reaction was instantaneous, a terrifying display of muscle memory honed through decades of surviving the worst of the Russian underworld. He didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. His large, powerful hand clamped down on Lily's shoulder, his grip unyielding, but surprisingly careful not to crush her collarbone. In one fluid, violent motion, he hauled her off the velvet sofa and threw her behind the massive reinforced structure of the kitchen's Italian marble island. Keep your head down and your hands over your ears. Nikolai ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos with absolute, chilling authority. He didn't wait for her to nod. He turned his back to her, stepping out from the cover of the marble, his suppressed Sig Sauer already rising to eye level. Dmitri was already at the vanguard. The giant enforcer had kicked over a heavy solid oak dining table, using it as a makeshift barricade near the private elevator foyer. 4 heavily armed men in matte black tactical gear spilled out of the service elevators. They moved with military precision, sweeping the room with the laser sights of their automatic rifles. But they were fighting ghosts. Nikolai moved like a shadow detached from the darkness. He fired 3 times in rapid succession. Pft, pft, pft. The sounds were muffled, barely audible over the roaring wind, but the results were devastating. 3 of Rossi's tactical operatives dropped to the marble floor, neutralized instantly, before they could even register the location of the shooter. Lily curled into the tightest ball her body would allow, pressing her back against the cold, unyielding stone of the kitchen island. Her hands were clamped over her ears, but the vibrations of the gunfight rattled through her teeth. Her chest heaved her lungs, struggling to find oxygen in the panic. Her fingers, entirely numb, were locked in a death grip around the silver double-headed eagle pendant hidden beneath her shirt. The cheap metal chain bit into the back of her neck, a physical reminder of the lethal gravity she now carried. Just hours ago, she was worrying about making rent and avoiding Roberto's temper. Now she was the epicenter of a multi-million-dollar mob war. "Boss, they are rappelling from the roof," Dmitri bellowed over the din, firing short, controlled bursts from his assault rifle to keep the surviving hallway operatives pinned down. Nikolai cursed loudly in Russian. He looked up at the shattered remnants of the panoramic windows. Dark, silhouette-like figures were sliding down thick nylon ropes from the roof terrace, their boots hitting the balcony tiles with heavy thuds. "We are leaving, now," Nikolai stated. He dropped to a crouch, sliding behind the marble island next to Lily. He grabbed her arm, hauling her to her feet. "Do not look at the bodies. Do not look at the blood. You look only at the center of my back. Do you understand me?" Lily could only manage a frantic, terrified nod. Her eyes were wide, taking in the terrifying transformation of the man before her. The sophisticated, brooding billionaire who had poured a drink just moments ago was entirely gone. In his place was the apex predator of New York's criminal ecosystem. Nikolai kept himself positioned firmly between Lily and the shattered windows. He laid down a suppressing fire that forced the newly arrived hitmen to dive behind the ruined velvet sofas. Using the precious seconds of cover, he dragged Lily toward the far end of the penthouse, away from the elevators and toward his private study. "Dmitri, fall back to the secondary extraction point. The panic suite," Nikolai roared. "Go! I will hold the choke point," Dmitri yelled back. But just as he turned to fire another volley, a high-velocity round tore through the heavy oak table, striking Dmitri cleanly in the left shoulder. The giant man grunted, spinning from the impact, his blood spraying across the minimalist white walls in a stark, horrific contrast. Lily screamed a raw, primal sound of horror. "Dmitri!" Nikolai's voice cracked for the first time, betraying the deep, brotherly bond that existed beneath their cold, professional exterior. Nikolai shoved Lily into the study, slamming his hand against a concealed biometric scanner hidden beneath a framed painting of the Ural Mountains. The bookcase groaned, sliding open to reveal a reinforced steel door. "Get inside," he commanded her, before turning back to the living room. Without a second thought for his own safety, Nikolai charged back into the crossfire. He grabbed the wounded Dmitri by the collar of his tactical vest, hauling the 300-pound man across the floor, while simultaneously returning fire with deadly accuracy. Another of Rossi's men fell clutching his throat, but the sheer volume of bullets tearing up the penthouse was overwhelming. Nikolai dragged Dmitri into the study, throwing him to the floor just as the tactical team reached the hallway. Nikolai slammed his palm against the scanner again. The heavy steel door of the panic room slammed shut, engaging multiple deadbolts with a series of heavy metallic clacks that finalized their isolation from the war zone outside. The panic room was not a mere closet. It was a state-of-the-art survival bunker, equipped with its own ventilation, medical supplies, and an encrypted communication hub. But more importantly, it contained a secondary secure elevator shaft that dropped straight down into the bedrock of the city, bypassing the building's main infrastructure entirely. Dmitri slumped against the steel wall, panting heavily. His massive hand applied pressure to his bleeding shoulder, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. "I am sorry, boss." He rasped, his voice thick with pain. "They knew the layout. They knew the blind spots." "Save your breath, my friend," Nikolai said, moving swiftly to a heavy red medical kit mounted on the wall. He ripped it open, pulling out combat gauze and pressure bandages. They had inside intel. Rossi could never have bypassed the lobby biometric scanners without an executive override. Someone in our inner circle sold us out. Lily stood trembling in the center of the cramped room. The sterile fluorescent lighting made the blood on Dimitri's hands look impossibly bright. She felt her stomach pitch violently, the metallic scent of blood mixing with the lingering smell of gunpowder on Nikolai's clothes. "Here," Nikolai said, pressing the bandages hard against Dimitri's wound. He looked up at Lily, his icy blue eyes softening just a fraction. "Breathe, Lily. In through your nose, out through your mouth. You survived the breach. The worst is behind us for tonight." He stood up and walked to a heavy steel panel on the floor. He lifted the latch, revealing a dark, narrow shaft and a reinforced, cage-like elevator car. "This drops us into an abandoned service tunnel connected to the MTA subway system. We will be ghosts in the underground." The descent was agonizingly slow and silent. The elevator groaned against its tracks, plunging them deep beneath the chaotic streets of Manhattan. Lily huddled in the corner of the cage, her arms wrapped around her knees. She watched Nikolai as he stood over Dimitri, his face an unreadable mask of cold calculation. An hour later, they emerged from a forgotten maintenance hatch in the deep recesses of the Brooklyn subway tunnels. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and old ozone. Nikolai led them through a maze of graffiti-covered corridors until they reached a nondescript rusted metal door. He knocked in a specific, syncopated rhythm. A moment later, the door swung open to reveal a dimly lit basement. Standing in the doorway was an older man with graying hair, wearing a worn cardigan and thick spectacles. He looked like a retired university professor, entirely out of place in the criminal underworld. "William," Nikolai said, his voice exhausted but guarded. "We need sanctuary. The Tribeca safe house is burned. Rossi hit us." William's eyes widened in shock as he took in the sight of the bleeding Dimitri and the terrified, disheveled Lily. "Good Lord, Nikolai. Come in quickly. I have the medical suite prepped in the back." This was the syndicate's deepest shadow, a network of off-the-books safe houses, maintained by retirees who owed their lives to Nikolai's father. William had been the family's accountant 30 years ago, long before the brutal purges that put Nikolai in power. As William and Nikolai moved Dimitri to a sterile back room to stitch his wound, Lily collapsed onto a worn leather sofa in the center of the basement. The adrenaline finally abandoned her, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She pulled her knees to her chest, the silver pendant feeling heavier than ever. An hour later, Nikolai emerged from the back room. He had discarded his ruined suit jacket, his white dress shirt stained with Dimitri's blood, and rolled up at the sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle and faded scars. He walked over to a small kitchenette, filled a kettle with water, and placed it on an old gas stove. "Dimitri will live," Nikolai said quietly, not looking at her as he prepared 2 cups of tea. "The bullet passed clean through the deltoid. He is resting." He walked over and handed Lily a steaming mug. The warmth of the ceramic seeped into her freezing hands. Nikolai didn't sit on the sofa beside her. Instead, he pulled up a wooden chair, sitting backward on it, resting his arms over the backrest. He looked at her truly, looked at her, stripping away the terrifying aura of the Mafia boss and revealing the exhausted, haunted man beneath. "I am sorry I dragged you into this violence, Lily," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "When I saw that pendant, when I heard that song, reason left me. I have spent my entire life building an empire of blood just to ensure that no one could ever hurt my family again. And yet, I failed the one piece of family I had left in Queens. Lily looked down at the tea. Anya, Mrs. Volkov. She never spoke of you. She never spoke of Russia. She told me she was a refugee who escaped a bad marriage. Why did she run? Nikolai's jaw tightened. Because my father was a monster. He was the head of the Bratva in Yekaterinburg, but he was driven mad by greed. He believed my mother and her sister Anya had stolen the family's emergency offshore accounts, the accounts that Pendant unlocks. In a drunken rage, he murdered my mother in front of me. Nikolai's voice didn't waver, but the emptiness in his eyes was far more terrifying than anger. Anya took the key and fled to America to protect the money from him, and to ensure he could never fund a war to come after her. I killed my father when I was 18. I took his throne, but I never found her. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. That pendant is the key to $300 million in untraceable Swiss bearer bonds. Dominic Rossi wants it to fund a hostile takeover of the entire eastern seaboard. If he gets it, he will slaughter every loyalist I have, and he will kill you simply for knowing what it is. Lily reached up her fingers, trembling, as she pulled the heavy silver chain over her head. She held the pendant out to him. Then take it. Take it, use the money, defeat him. Just let me go. Nikolai didn't reach for the necklace. He looked at her outstretched hand, shaking his head slowly. It is not that simple. The accounts require the physical key, but they also require a biometric blood match from the Volkov matriarchal line. My mother is dead. Anya is dead. You are holding a piece of silver that is useless without the right blood. Lily frowned, deep confusion creasing her brow. But I'm not related to you. I'm just a foster kid. I don't have Russian blood. Nikolai sighed, running a hand over his tired face. Rossi doesn't know that. He believes you are Anya's secret daughter. He believes you are the biological heir. Until I can crush his organization entirely, you are the most valuable hostage in North America. Before Lily could process this horrifying revelation, the heavy wooden door of the basement creaked open. William stepped into the room holding a tray with fresh bandages, but his hands were shaking, and he wouldn't meet Nikolai's eyes. William. Nikolai asked, his instincts instantly flaring. He sat up straighter, his hand subtly dropping toward his holster. What is wrong? William swallowed hard, a tear spilling over his wrinkled cheek. I am so sorry, Nikolai. They took my granddaughter in Staten Island this morning. They said they would mail her to me in pieces if I didn't send the location of the secondary safe houses. Nikolai was on his feet in a microsecond, his weapon drawn and aimed squarely at the old accountant's chest. They are already here. William wept, dropping the tray of bandages. The heavy steel door at the top of the basement stairs suddenly blew inward with a catastrophic explosion. Smoke and debris rained down the stairwell, and the heavy rhythmic thud of tactical boots echoed into the basement. Get down! Nikolai roared, diving across the room and tackling Lily to the floor, just as a hail of submachine gun fire shredded the leather sofa, where she had been sitting seconds before. The air filled with a blinding cloud of plaster dust and the deafening roar of automatic weapons. Dominic Rossi walked down the stairs. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored pale grey suit, his hair slicked back with expensive product, entirely unbothered by the violence his men were orchestrating. He held a silver-plated revolver by his side, stepping carefully over the rubble. Behind him were 6 heavily armed enforcers. Nikolai, my old friend. Rossi called out, his voice smooth and dripping with mock sympathy. Look at you, scurrying in the dirt like a rat. It breaks my heart to see the great Rostov syndicate reduced to hiding in Brooklyn basements. Nikolai shoved Lily under the heavy oak desk in the corner of the room, positioning his body as a human shield. He fired twice, hitting one of Rossi's men in the knee, causing the man to scream and collapse. But the sheer number of guns pointed at their corner made a shootout suicidal. "Hold your fire!" Rossi commanded his men. He smiled a cold reptilian stretch of the lips. "We don't want to damage the merchandise. Bring out the girl Nikolai. Hand over the Volkov heir and the pendant, and I will let you walk away. You can keep your little racketeering operations in Queens. I just want the Swiss accounts." "She is not the heir, Dominic," Nikolai shouted back, his voice steady, despite the impossible odds. "You have bad intel. The bloodline died with my aunt. The pendant is useless." Rossi laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound. "Always playing chess, Nikolai. But I have the board surrounded. If she isn't the heir, then you won't mind if I put a bullet in her head right now to save us both the trouble." Rossi raised his revolver, pointing it directly at the space beneath the desk where Lily was hiding. "I'll give you 3 seconds. 1. Nikolai's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked down at Lily. Her eyes were squeezed shut, tears streaming down her dirty cheeks, her lips moving in a silent, panicked prayer. In that fleeting second, Nikolai realized something that fundamentally shifted his universe. He had spent his life protecting an empire of concrete money and fear. But looking at this innocent girl, the girl who had sung his mother's lullaby and offered him tea in a freezing basement, he realized his empire meant absolutely nothing without humanity. 2, Rossi called out. "Wait." Nikolai said, his voice echoing loudly in the tense silence. Slowly, deliberately, Nikolai stood up from behind the desk. He raised his hands in the air. In his left hand, he held his Sig Sauer by the barrel, presenting the grip to Rossi. In his right hand, the silver double-headed eagle pendant dangled from its cheap chain, glinting in the harsh basement light. Lily gasped, crawling to the edge of the desk. "No, Nikolai, don't." Rossi smiled in triumph. He gestured for 2 of his men to move forward. They snatched the gun from Nikolai's hand and roughly patted him down, disarming him completely. Rossi stepped closer, his eyes locked greedily on the silver pendant. "A wise choice," Rossi sneered. "I always knew, underneath all that brutal Russian posturing, you were a pragmatist." Rossi reached out to take the pendant, but Nikolai didn't drop it into the Italian boss's hand. Instead, his gaze hardened into the glacial, terrifying stare of the apex predator. "You are right, Dominic. I am a pragmatist, and a pragmatist knows you never bring a gun to a knife fight in close quarters." With lightning speed, Nikolai's right hand whipped the heavy silver pendant directly into Rossi's face. The solid metal eagle caught Rossi square in the eye, temporarily blinding him and causing him to stagger backward with a cry of pain. Simultaneously, Nikolai's left hand, now empty, shot out and grabbed the wrist of the enforcer, standing closest to him. He twisted violently, snapping the man's wrist with a sickening crunch, and ripped the combat knife from the enforcer's tactical vest. In a singular fluid motion of pure lethal geometry, Nikolai spun and drove the hilt of the knife into the throat of the second enforcer, dropping him instantly. The basement erupted into absolute chaos. Rossi, clutching his bleeding eye, fired his revolver blindly. The bullet ricocheted off the concrete wall, missing Nikolai by inches. Lily didn't freeze this time. The paralysis of fear that had defined her entire life shattered. She saw Nikolai fighting 3 men barehanded, severely outgunned and outmatched. She crawled out from under the desk, her eyes frantically scanning the room. Her gaze landed on the heavy cast-iron kettle still resting on the gas stove where Nikolai had made tea. She lunged for it, grabbing the handle. The metal was scalding hot, blistering her palm, but the adrenaline masked the pain. She swung the heavy iron pot with all her meager strength, just as Rossi aimed his revolver at Nikolai's back. The cast-iron kettle slammed into the back of Rossi's skull with a dull, hollow thud. The mob boss's eyes rolled back his gun, firing wildly into the ceiling as he collapsed to the concrete floor like a puppet with its strings cut. Distracted by the sound of their boss falling, the remaining enforcers hesitated for a fraction of a second. It was all Nikolai needed. He moved with ruthless efficiency, utilizing the tight space of the basement to neutralize the remaining threats, using the stolen combat knife and brutal close-quarters martial arts. Within 30 seconds, the basement was eerily silent, save for the groans of the wounded men on the floor. Nikolai stood in the center of the carnage, his chest heaving, his hands covered in blood. He dropped the knife. He turned slowly to look at Lily. She was standing near the stove, clutching her burned hand to her chest, her eyes wide with shock at her own actions. She looked at the unconscious Rossi, then up at Nikolai. The towering Mafia boss walked over to her, entirely ignoring the danger surrounding them. He gently took her burned hand in his large, calloused ones. The tenderness in his touch was a stark, almost unbelievable contrast to the extreme violence he had just committed. "You saved my life," Nikolai whispered, his voice thick with a profound, earth-shattering realization. Lily swallowed hard, a tremulous smile breaking through her shock. "You saved mine first." Suddenly, the wail of police sirens pierced the night air above them. William's neighbors had finally reported the gunfire. Red and blue lights began flashing through the tiny basement windows. Nikolai scooped the silver pendant off the floor and slipped it into his pocket. He wrapped his arm tightly around Lily's waist. "We cannot be here when the authorities arrive. Dmitri is conscious. I signaled him to use the secondary exit. We must go." They fled through the labyrinth of the subway tunnels, leaving behind the shattered remains of Rossi's empire. The arrest of Dominic Rossi at the safe house, surrounded by illegal weapons and an unconscious hit squad, was the fatal blow to the Camorra faction in New York. The federal authorities dismantled his operations within weeks, while Nikolai Rostov and his inner circle seemingly vanished into thin air 6 months later. The autumn sun shone brightly over the rugged coastline of Maine, casting a golden hue over the quiet, secluded harbor town. The air smelled of salt and pine, a world away from the gasoline and blood that had stained the floors of Moretti's restaurant. Lily stood on the wraparound porch of a beautiful cedar shingle house overlooking the ocean. She wore a thick wool sweater, her burned scars completely healed. She held a mug of hot coffee, watching the waves crash against the rocks. She was no longer a terrified waitress, barely surviving the crushing weight of poverty. She was grounded, safe, and wildly, fiercely loved. The screen door creaked open behind her. Nikolai stepped onto the porch. He was dressed simply in dark jeans and a heavy flannel shirt, his dark hair ruffled by the sea breeze. The hard glacial edge to his blue eyes had melted, replaced by a quiet, protective warmth that he reserved only for her. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his solid chest, resting his chin on the top of her head. "Dmitri called," Nikolai murmured, his low baritone vibrating against her. "The transition is complete. The violent operations are entirely dismantled. The syndicate is now fully legitimate. Real estate logistics and legal shipping. The blood money is gone." Lily turned in his arms, looking up into his eyes. "And the pendant? The Swiss accounts?" Nikolai smiled gently. "I melted the pendant down. It was a curse that destroyed my family. I will not let it touch our future. The money can rot in the vault for eternity. I have everything I need right here." He leaned down, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her lips. It was a promise, a vow written not in blood, but in the quiet peace they had fought so hard to build. As the sun began to set over the Atlantic painting, The sky in vibrant shades of orange and purple, Lily rested her head against his chest. She listened to the steady, strong beat of his heart. And softly, just loud enough for him to hear, she began to hum the sweet, melancholic melody of a Russian lullaby. Not to ward off terror, but to celebrate the deep, enduring peace they had finally found. Did Lily's bravery and the dramatic transformation of the ruthless Nikolai Rostov capture your heart? This thrilling tale of survival, loyalty, and unexpected romance proves that even the darkest empires can be brought to the light by the right person. If you loved this intense Mafia romance drama and want to hear more thrilling stories of danger, passion, and redemption, please hit that like button. Share this video with your friends who love a great twist, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life inspired stories. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Lily's shoes?